All right, let's start with a little mental exercise to get us grounded today. If I say the title Wuthering Heights to you, what is the very first immediate image that pops into your head? Just be honest.
Oh, I mean, it's the classic montage, right? It's the windswept hair, the desolate moors, these really passionate embraces in the rain. Maybe a little Kate Bush running up that hill playing in the background.
Right, right. It is the absolute ultimate brand for, like, tortured romance. It's the cover of 1,000 paperback novels you see in the store.
Yeah.
But we have a stack of analysis here today, specifically a really fascinating deep dive titled Visions of Obsession.
Yeah.
And it suggests we have all been sold a lie. A very pretty, very misleading lie.
A massive lie. Honestly, if you are tuning in to the deep dive today expecting us to talk about a cozy, sweeping love story or, something you'd want to read by a fireplace with a nice cup of tea, you might want to hit pause right now.
Yeah, fair warning.
Because, according to this analysis of the audiobook adaptation, Wuthering Heights isn't a romance at all. It is actually a psychological horror story that's basically just masquerading as a classic romance.
See, that is a really bold claim to make. Because everyone calls it a romance. I mean, it's famous for it.
Everyone calls it a romance because it features obsession. But the source material we are looking at today, this Visions of Obsession review, argues that Wuthering Heights is actually a clinical case study in emotional violence. It's about narcissism and it's about generational trauma. And specifically what we're looking at is how the audiobook format tears the mask off of all of that. When you just read the physical book, you can sort of romanticize the prose because Emily Bronte's writing is just so poetic.
Right.
But the argument here is that when you actually hear it, when you have to put headphones on and listen to these people scream and cry and manipulate each other, it becomes an entirely different beast.
So the medium actually changes the message that much.
Fundamentally, it takes it from a text you just sort of passively analyze in a classroom to a visceral event you basically have to survive.
Well, I'm ready to get disturbed then. Let's start right where the book starts. Because we really can't talk about Wuthering Heights without talking about the heights themselves, right? The Yorkshire moors.
Yeah, the setting that really isn't just a setting at all.
Right, the analysis actually calls the moors a character. Now, I have to push back on that just a little bit because, that's a cliche we hear in literary reviews all the time.
Oh, definitely.
Like New York was the fifth character in Sex and the City, that kind of thing. It's almost a trope. But does it actually hold water here? Or is the reviewer just using literary fluff?
In this specific case, it is absolutely not fluff. It is a very literal application of a literary device called pathetic fallacy.
Okay, break that down for us.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I remember that term from high school English, but I definitely need a refresher.
So, pathetic fallacy is basically when the external environment entirely mirrors the internal emotional state of the characters in the story. So in Wuthering Heights, the landscape of the moors is completely barren. It's wind-battered, it's dangerous, and it is incredibly isolating.
There's like no shelter out there.
Exactly. No shelter at all. And that is exactly what is happening inside Heathcliff and Catherine. They aren't just living on the moors, they are the moors. Their souls are just as jagged and inhospitable as the dirt they're walking on.
And this is where the audiobook aspect seems to do some really heavy lifting, according to our source. Because reading a description of the wind on a page is one thing, but the review notes that a high-production audiobook creates this sort of sonic isolation.
Yes, think about the difference in the experience. When you're reading a physical book, you can just skim a long paragraph about the weather to get to the dialogue. You are entirely in control of the pacing.
Right, you just skip ahead.
But with audio, you don't have that luxury. You are trapped in that atmosphere. The source highlights the incredibly effective use of soundscaping here.
Like the sound effects and the ambient noise.
Yeah, the howling wind in the background, but also the long, incredibly uncomfortable silences between the lines of dialogue. It forces the listener to actually feel that physical oppression.
It creates a, what do the notes call it, a haunting atmosphere.
Exactly. And haunting is really the key word for this deep dive. The analysis points out that the audio format heavily amplifies the gothic elements of the story. And we aren't just talking about ghosts, though. There are ghosts in the book.
Yeah, literal ghosts.
Right, but we are also talking about the sound of a house that is literally falling apart around them. The creaking doors, the harshness of the natural environment. It creates what the reviewer explicitly calls emotional realism. You actually feel cold while you're listening to it.
That's so interesting because usually, audiobooks are comfort food for a lot of people. You listen to them while you do the laundry or while you drive to work.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds really stressful.
Oh, it's intended to be stressful. The source explicitly warns that the story disturbs you. It completely removes the protective barrier between you and the abuse that's happening inside that house.
Okay, so we have this deeply hostile environment, and it's amplified by the sound design. But we also really need to talk about the structure of the story itself. Because I remember trying to read this back in college, and honestly, I was confused half the time.
Oh, it's tough.
I kept having to flip back pages just to figure out who was even talking.
You are definitely not alone in that. Wuthering Heights is notoriously difficult to follow structurally. It's a very challenging read.
It's the Russian nesting doll problem, right?
Precisely. It uses a very specific technique called a frame narrative.
Which is what exactly, just for the listeners?
A story within a story. So you have a character named Lockwood who is renting a house on the property, and he is listening to his housekeeper, a woman named Nellie Dean, tell him a story about Heathcliff. But within her story, she is often quoting what other people told her.
So you are sometimes 3 layers deep in narration.
Exactly. It's basically a 19th century game of telephone.
That is wild. And in text, that can be an absolute nightmare to track.
Yeah.
You just lose track of who is actually speaking. Like, is this Lockwood right now? Is this Nellie? Is this Heathcliff speaking to Nellie being retold to Lockwood?
And this is exactly where the source says the audiobook format is an absolute game changer.
Specifically, audiobooks that use multiple narrators. I thought that was a huge technical advantage they pointed out.
It's massive. The analysis really praises productions that cast entirely different voice actors for the different layers of the narrative. So if you hear a gruff, slightly confused man speaking, you immediately know that's Lockwood. You hear a sensible, older Yorkshire woman, you know that's Nellie.
So it's basically audio coding the structure for your brain. You don't have to do the mental work to figure out the context. You just hear the shift in voice.
And it does something else that's arguably even more important, too. It highlights the bias in the story. This is a really crucial insight from our notes today. Nellie Dean is not an objective reporter of these events. She is an unreliable narrator.
Wait, really? Because I always assumed Nellie was sort of the voice of reason in the whole mess. Like, she's the one taking care of everyone while they go crazy.
That's the brilliant trick of the book. She absolutely wants you to think she's the voice of reason, but she has really strong opinions. She absolutely hates Heathcliff. She meddles in people's affairs constantly.
Okay.
When you just read the words on a page, you might take her word as absolute fact because she's positioned as the narrator. But when you hear an actor performing her lines with a specific tone of judgment, or maybe she sounds gossipy or deeply self-righteous, you suddenly realize, oh, she's spinning this entire story.
That's a great point. It turns the whole book into almost a true crime podcast vibe. You're listening to a witness testimony, and you as the listener have to actively decide if you even trust them.
That is a perfect analogy. You are essentially the jury, and you are listening to a whole lot of hearsay.
Speaking of things that are really hard to understand in the written book, we have to talk about the dialect. This is something the source really hammered on in the review. I remember looking at the pages in school and seeing these words spelled out phonetically.
Oh boy.
Lots of apostrophes everywhere, vowels missing. It honestly looked like a secret code.
Ah, yes. The character of Joseph. He is the absolute bane of every high school student's existence.
He's the servant, right? The really grumpy older guy?
Yes, the intensely religious, intensely grumpy servant. Emily Brontë wrote all of his dialogue in a very thick, very heavy Yorkshire dialect. And on the physical page, it is almost completely indecipherable to a modern reader.
Yeah, it stops the flow of reading completely.
It really does. You basically have to sound it out loud in your room just to guess what he's even trying to say.
But the source mentions this specific thing as a major pro for the audiobook format.
Because a skilled voice narrator, often an actual native of Yorkshire, can just speak it fluidly. And suddenly, all this visual gibberish on the page becomes a really rich, highly authentic accent. You instantly understand the rhythm of a speech. You hear the grumpiness. You feel the stark class distinction between him and the other characters.
That's a huge accessibility point right there. It just completely lowers the barrier to entry for the story. You aren't constantly fighting the text. You're just experiencing the character as a real person.
It preserves the local flavor of the region without giving the modern audience a massive headache trying to decode it. It turns a huge hurdle into a standout feature of the performance.
Okay, so we've got the oppressive atmosphere, we've got the layered structure sorted out, we've got the Yorkshire accents. Now we really have to wade into the swamp, the characters themselves, because the source calls Heathcliff one of literature's most complex anti-heroes.
Honestly, I'd argue even calling him an anti-hero is being incredibly generous.
Well, that's the big debate, isn't it? The source asks the ultimate question here, is Heathcliff a villain or a victim? Because if you actually look at his rap sheet in the book, it's not looking great for him.
It's terrible. If you just look at the cold, hard facts of what he does, he hangs little puppies. He physically and emotionally abuses his wife. He manipulates his own son to the point where the boy becomes deathly ill. He literally digs up a grave to hold a dead woman. I mean, these are the undeniable actions of a monster.
So why do we care about him? Why has he endured as this famous romantic lead for over a century?
Because the audiobook forces you to hear the pain underneath all of that cruelty. This is where the vocal performance aspect is absolutely vital. The source notes that a truly good narrator captures the crack of heartbreak right underneath all his anger.
Wow.
You hear the sneer in his voice, yes, but you also hear the profound desperation. You suddenly see the immense trauma that forged him into this monster.
So he fits that very specific literary archetype. What's the term for it?
The Byronic hero.
Right. Can you define that for us real quick? Because I feel like people just throw that phrase around to mean any guy who is a bit moody.
It's definitely a bit more intense than just being moody. A Byronic hero is highly intelligent, they're isolated, they're deeply arrogant, and they are capable of incredibly deep emotion, but they are also capable of great cruelty.
They're bad news.
Very bad news. They are inherently dangerous to know, and they are usually haunted by some dark secret or a massive past trauma. But unlike a modern bad boy trope in romance novels today, where the guy secretly has a heart of gold underneath it all, Heathcliff really doesn't. He has a heart of pure obsession.
And that obsession is entirely directed at Catherine Earnshaw. Now, pop culture often paints her as this tragic damsel, or maybe just the helpless victim of Heathcliff's sheer intensity. But the analysis we're looking at shuts that interpretation down pretty hard.
It sure does. It describes Catherine as messy, impulsive, and deeply passionate. She is not a passive flower waiting to be rescued. She is just as destructive as he is, if not more so at times.
The source uses the phrase emotional instability to describe her.
I honestly think that's just a very polite way of saying she is profoundly narcissistic. She loves Heathcliff because she literally sees him as herself. You remember her most famous line from the book, right? I am Heathcliff.
Which is almost always read as this beautiful romantic sentiment.
It is. People literally put that quote on their wedding invitations. But the source argues that in the audiobook, when you hear the frantic, unhinged energy in the narrator's voice, it doesn't sound like a romance at all. It sounds like a total identity crisis. It sounds like she genuinely cannot distinguish where she ends and he begins.
That's terrifying.
It is deeply terrifying. It's codependency at a level that just destroys everyone unfortunate enough to be around them. The source actually calls their relationship obsessive, destructive, and almost spiritual.
Almost spiritual.
Yeah.
That phrasing implies it kind of transcends the physical world.
Well, they're quite literally haunting each other, metaphorically and literally. The expert commentary notes that this central theme of a love that destroys feels surprisingly modern to a contemporary reader.
It really does. It heavily reminds me of shows like You or Gone Girl. As a culture, we are still completely fascinated by these extremely toxic dynamics.
We really are. We might not relate to the 1840s social etiquette or wearing corsets every day, but we absolutely recognize the sheer danger of unchecked passion. The idea that love isn't always a good thing, that sometimes it can actually be a sickness.
And this leads us to a really interesting comparison that the source makes. It's the ultimate Brontë showdown. Emily versus Charlotte. Wuthering Heights versus Jane Eyre.
Oh, it's the classic literary sibling rivalry.
How does the source actually distinguish them? Because to a casual reader who hasn't picked them up in years, they're both kind of just grouped together as gloomy Victorian novels about governesses on the moors.
It frames the difference entirely around the concept of control. Jane Eyre, which is Charlotte's masterpiece, is fundamentally about moral strength. It's a story about a woman finding her own agency, asserting her profound self-respect, and most importantly, having the power to say no. Jane basically says, I respect myself too much to degrade my morals just for love.
Right. It's a very ordered, moral universe.
Yeah.
Good things happen to good people eventually if they stay true to themselves.
Exactly. But Wuthering Heights, Emily's book, is the complete and total opposite of that. It is entirely about emotional chaos. It is about the absolute loss of control. Literally, no one in this book says no to their dark impulses. They scream, they run out into storms, they die of heartbreak and starvation.
So if Jane Eyre is essentially about the triumph of the rational mind, Wuthering Heights is the triumph of the irrational heart.
That is beautifully put, and that is exactly why the source warns that if you go into this audiobook expecting Jane Eyre, you are going to be absolutely horrified. Wuthering Heights does not have a moral center. The author doesn't step in to tell you who is right and who is wrong. It just shows you the emotional wreckage and leaves you there.
Speaking of wreckage, the source lists some really heavy themes that the book explores way beyond just the toxic romance. Things like revenge across generations, class struggle, trauma.
Class struggle is a really big one that often gets totally lost in the shiny movie adaptations. You have to remember, Heathcliff is an outsider. He's brought into this wealthy, established family as a starving orphan, and he's likely of a different race or ethnicity. The book specifically describes him as dark-skinned, and he is systematically, brutally abused by the family because of his low status. So his lifelong revenge isn't just about lost love. It's about completely burning down the social hierarchy that rejected and degraded him.
Which makes him a sort of revolutionary figure in a way, just a very, very violent one.
A scorched earth revolutionary. He doesn't just want to be equal, he wants to literally own the people who used to own him.
Wow. Now we really have to talk about the weaknesses or the warning section in our source material, because I just love a good warning label on a classic piece of literature. It makes it feel like forbidden fruit.
This is a quite honest review of the experience. It explicitly warns listeners of heavy emotional negativity.
Heavy emotional negativity. Honestly, that should just be the blurb printed on the back of the book. Read this, you will feel terrible.
It also warns of some slow pacing in the middle sections.
I think that's totally fair. Once the first generation of characters grows up and the initial drama peaks, there is a bit of a lull in the plot before the second generation's drama really kicks into gear.
And it also warns that some characters are intentionally frustrating to listen to.
And intentionally frustrating is just reviewer code for you're going to want to throw your phone across the room while listening, isn't it?
It absolutely is. But here's the deeper insight from the review. The book demands emotional maturity from the listener. You have to be able to just sit with the profound discomfort of the story. You have to be completely okay with not liking the people you are spending hours of your time with.
And that's a really hard sell for a lot of people today. We are so trained by modern media to root for the protagonist. We desperately want the hero to win and learn a good lesson.
We do. We always want the hero's journey. But this is an anti-hero's descent into madness. The source is explicitly clear on this point. Do not read or listen to this if you want a clean, healthy romance. It will not give that to you.
So looking at the final verdict from the review, they gave the audiobook a 4.5 out of 5 stars, which is incredibly high for an experience that, quite frankly, sounds like a completely miserable time.
It really is high. But the reasoning they provide is incredibly compelling. The verdict states that the story is uncomfortable, yes. It is haunting, yes. But most importantly, it stays with you long after it's over.
It really sticks to your ribs.
It leaves a scar. You know, you can read a nice, clean romance novel and totally forget the plot a week later. But you do not forget the sound of Heathcliff violently begging Catherine's ghost to haunt him for the rest of his life because he physically cannot live without his own soul. That kind of imagery, especially when acted out vocally, just burns into your brain.
So let's break down the target audience here before we wrap up. Who is this deep dive ultimately recommending the audiobook to?
If you are a lover of very dark psychological stories, if you really like complex, morally gray characters who do bad things, and if you appreciate being immersed in that heavy, gothic atmosphere, this production is an absolute masterpiece for you.
And who should run the other way as fast as possible?
Anyone looking for light escapism. Anyone who wants a protagonist they can admire or look up to. If you need a good guy to win in the end, you will find absolutely nothing here but pure frustration.
It really sounds like it's a masterclass in the exact title of our source today, Visions of Obsession.
It totally deconstructs the entire idea of love until only the raw, jagged, bleeding edges are left.
You know, talking about all of this with you today, it really shifts my perspective on what we call classics. We tend to sanitize them so much in our culture. We just naturally think of Victorian literature as these very stiff, polite, tea-drinking affairs in drawing rooms.
Right, the whole stiff upper lip stereotype.
Exactly. But this conversation is a great reminder that people back in 1847 were just as messy, just as wildly passionate, and just as deeply damaged as we are right now. Maybe even more so.
I would argue perhaps more so because the social container they were forced to live in was so much smaller and tighter. The social rules of the time were incredibly rigid, so when that repressed emotion finally exploded, it had absolutely nowhere to go but toward total destruction.
That is such a great visual. It's the pressure cooker effect.
Exactly. And that actually brings me to a final thought I'd really love for you, the listener, to mull over today. We spent a lot of time talking about the moors as a character, how the landscape is violent, windy, and desolate. And we've talked about Heathcliff and Catherine's obsession being violent, destructive, and isolating.
Yeah, they're total mirrors of each other.
They are, but consider the specific idea regarding the audiobook format itself. The source describes the audio experience as haunting. Now, usually in a classic Gothic novel, a haunting involves a literal ghost, a spirit coming back from the dead to scare people. And Wuthering Heights technically has that element.
Sure, you have Catherine appearing at the window early on.
But what if the haunting that the source is describing isn't actually about the literal ghosts at all? What if the real haunting is the terrifying realization that true, completely unchecked human passion is entirely indistinguishable from madness?
Wait, say more on that.
Well, we spend our whole lives looking for passion, right? We want the fireworks. We want the all-consuming love. But this story suggests that if you actually find it, if you find passion in its absolute purest, wildest form, it doesn't look like a pretty love song. It looks like the barren moors. It looks like a storm that will literally kill you.
It just looks like pure insanity.
Exactly. And here is the real question to walk away with today. Does the audiobook format force us to confront that specific madness in a way that the written word allows us to ignore? Because when you read a physical book, you can just look away from the page, you can close the cover, you can detach yourself intellectually, but when you listen, with that narrator's voice whispering all of this grief and rage directly into your ear, you are letting the madness in. You are essentially inviting the ghost directly into your own head.
Whoa, that is definitely going to keep me up tonight.
Then the book and the brilliant audiobook adaptation of it has entirely done its job.
I guess so. I'm definitely going to need to listen to something very, very cheerful after this. Maybe a baking podcast or a cookbook or something.
It was a very solid choice to decompress.
Well, that is a wrap on our deep dive into the audio world of Wuthering Heights. Whether you decide to brave the storms of the moors yourself, or if you decide to stay safely by the fire with Jane Eyre. Thanks so much for listening.
Until next time.
See you in the next deep dive.